I saved his drowning daughter. The Mafia boss kneels. I've never owed anyone. Tell me how to repay this. The October morning carried the scent of dying leaves and cold water. Autumn's promise of decay wrapped in golden light that made Central Park look almost innocent. I'd been sitting on the same bench for 43 minutes, paperback novel open but unread in my lap, watching Luca Moretti exist in the only slice of normalcy his blood-soaked life allowed. Saturdays at 10 o'clock, same routine for 8 months, same bench overlooking conservatory water. Same security detail positioned at careful intervals around the perimeter. Same 5-year-old daughter who wore pink rain boots regardless of weather and collected fallen leaves like they were precious jewels. My name is Vera Kozlov, and I was 28 years old the day I decided to save the child of the man who'd destroyed my family. The irony wasn't lost on me. 2 years of planning, 8 months of surveillance, countless hours studying every pattern in Luca Moretti's carefully controlled existence, and the perfect opening was about to present itself through his greatest vulnerability, his daughter Chiara, who laughed like wind chimes and called her father Papa in Italian that sounded sweeter than prayers. I'd spent those 2 years learning everything about the man who'd killed my sister. Anya had been 26 when she died, a journalist with the kind of integrity that got people killed in cities like New York. She'd been investigating human trafficking rings, following leads that took her deeper into the criminal underworld than her editor knew or approved. Her final article, the one she'd never finished, had focused on Luca Moretti's organization. 3 days after her last frantic phone call telling me she'd found something big, something that would bring the whole operation down, police discovered her body in her apartment. Staged suicide, pills and alcohol, a note that didn't sound like her voice. Case closed within a week because dead journalists who investigated. Mafia operations rarely generated follow-up questions from authorities who valued their own survival. I hadn't believed the suicide ruling for a single second. Anya fought too hard, loved life too fiercely, had too much she still wanted to accomplish. Someone had silenced her, and every thread of her investigation led back to Luca Moretti. Most feared boss in New York's organized crime hierarchy, the man who controlled everything from waterfront shipping to high-end art smuggling, whose name made federal prosecutors nervous and rival families cautious. He'd killed my sister to protect his empire, made it look like depression and self-destruction, and continued his life as if snuffing out bright young women was simply the cost of doing business. So I'd left my position with a private intelligence agency, the kind of firm that didn't officially exist, and whose clients included governments and corporations with problems requiring extra-legal solutions. I'd been good at my work, skilled in surveillance and infiltration, trained in methods that prioritized results over procedural concerns. Those skills had served me well in constructing the new identity I'd need to get close to someone as paranoid and protected as Luca Moretti. Vera Sokolova now, using my mother's maiden name to avoid any connection to Anya's published articles. Freelance translator with a modest apartment in Brooklyn and a background so meticulously constructed it would survive any investigation. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Insert myself into Luca Moretti's life through his greatest weakness. Gain his trust. Learn the intimate details of his operations, his security protocols, his business relationships. Then systematically dismantle everything he'd built, expose him to his enemies and law enforcement simultaneously, and ensure he lost everything before facing justice for Anya's murder. I wanted him destroyed from the inside. Wanted him to understand what it felt like to watch everything precious crumble while being powerless to stop it. Chiara was supposed to be leverage, not a person. The vulnerable point in his armor that would grant me access to his world. I'd watched her for months, noting her schedule and her habits, the way her father looked at her with something that might have been love if monsters were capable of such emotion. She attended no school, educated privately within the fortress of his estate. She had no friends her own age, only carefully vetted staff and security personnel who treated her like the princess of a very dark kingdom. Her only regular excursions into the normal world were these Saturday morning visits to Central Park, where Luca apparently believed the illusion of childhood normalcy outweighed security concerns. The security detail was professional but predictable. 4 visible guards positioned at compass points around the plaza, 2 more in civilian clothing maintaining roaming patrol, and undoubtedly additional personnel in nearby vehicles monitoring approaches. They'd grown comfortable with the routine, confident that Saturdays between 10 and 11:30 presented manageable risk in a public space with clear sight lines and limited access points. I'd spent weeks identifying their blind spots, timing their rotation patterns, noting how they prioritized threats. Today I'd arranged a distraction. A man I'd hired through channels that couldn't be traced back to me, someone with no connection to my old life or new identity, whose only job was to create a scene at precisely 10:45. Fake paparazzo with a camera, aggressively approaching the plaza as if trying to photograph the infamous Luca Moretti with his daughter. Security would converge on the threat, their attention focused on protecting their principal from exposure while maintaining cover in a public space. It would create a 15-second window. Not long, but sufficient for what needed to happen, except I hadn't arranged for Chiara to wander toward the water's edge. That wasn't part of my plan. I'd envisioned creating the crisis, positioning myself to solve it, establishing the foundation of gratitude and obligation. But at 10:43, 2 minutes before my hired distraction was supposed to appear, the little girl in pink rain boots abandoned the pile of leaves she'd been organizing and walked toward the low stone wall that separated the plaza from conservatory water, watched with growing unease as she climbed onto the wall, her small hands gripping the rough stone while she leaned forward to study something in the water below. Luca was 30 feet away, speaking on his phone with his back partially turned. The nearest security guard was checking his own phone, momentarily distracted. It was wrong, too convenient. My instincts, honed through years of intelligence work, screamed warnings I couldn't immediately identify. Then Chiara leaned too far forward, her balance shifting in that terrible slow-motion moment before disaster. Her hands slipped on the stone. Her small body pitched forward into water that would be shockingly cold in October, deep enough to be dangerous for a 5-year-old who suddenly wasn't visible above the surface. I was moving before conscious thought completed. Book falling forgotten from my lap as my legs propelled me across the plaza. Training took over, that automatic response to crisis that bypassed fear and doubt. I vaulted the low stone wall and hit the water in a dive that would have made my academy instructors proud. The shock of cold nothing compared to the clarity of purpose. The water was murky, limited visibility forcing me to search by touch more than sight. My hands found fabric, then a small arm, and I was pulling her upward toward light and air and survival. We broke the surface together, Chiara coughing and choking but alive, her arms instinctively wrapping around my neck with the desperate strength of a frightened child. I swam to the stone edge, lifting her out of the water before hauling myself up beside her. She was gasping, crying, shivering violently in wet clothes that clung to her tiny frame. I positioned her on her side, supporting her while water drained from her mouth and nose, her coughs gradually becoming more productive and less panicked. "You're okay," I heard myself saying, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "You're safe. Just breathe. That's good. Keep breathing." Then there were running footsteps, shouted commands, and suddenly the space around us filled with security personnel who'd failed to prevent their principal's daughter from nearly drowning. But they weren't who I noticed. I looked up and met the eyes of Luca Moretti as he dropped to his knees beside his daughter, his face transformed by absolute terror into something almost human. This was the man I'd studied through surveillance photographs and distant observation for 8 months. 6'2", dark hair that showed silver at the temples, sharp features that suggested Roman ancestry, and the kind of bone structure that would photograph well in magazines if his business allowed for publicity. He wore expensive casual clothing today, dark jeans and a leather jacket that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. But none of that registered as clearly as his expression, that raw fear of a parent confronting how close they'd come to losing everything that mattered. "Chiara." His voice broke on her name as he gathered her into his arms, seemingly unconcerned about water soaking his expensive clothing. "Tesoro, can you hear me? Are you hurt, Papa?" She clung to him, sobbing into his shoulder. I fell in the water and the lady saved me. The lady jumped in and saved me. That's when his attention shifted to me. Storm-gray eyes assessing in ways that made me acutely aware I was sitting in a puddle on cold stone, wearing clothes that revealed more than intended when wet, facing the most dangerous man in New York while vulnerable and exposed. His security detail surrounded us, but Luca's focus was absolute. That terrible intelligence I'd read about in classified files now directed entirely at understanding who I was and why I'd risked myself for his daughter. You jumped in after her. Not a question. Statement of fact delivered in a voice that carried authority even in crisis. Italian accent barely detectable beneath American polish. The result of a childhood split between Sicily and New York, according to the background files I'd compiled. She was drowning. My teeth were starting to chatter. Adrenaline crash combining with October water temperature to make coherent speech increasingly difficult. Anyone would have done the same. No. He stood, still holding Chiara, and offered me his hand to help me up. Most people would have screamed or looked for authorities. You acted without hesitation. Effective rescue technique. Military or law enforcement training? My pulse spiked. Too observant, too quick to analyze implications. I accepted his hand because refusing would create suspicion, feeling calluses that suggested he wasn't merely a businessman who delegated violence to subordinates. Lifeguard certification in college. Long time ago. His eyes said he didn't entirely believe me, but he nodded. Marco, get blankets from the car. Vincent, call Dr. Castellano and have him meet us at the house. Move. Security scattered to follow orders, leaving us in a strange bubble of sudden privacy amid public crisis. Chiara had stopped crying, her face buried against her father's neck, but her small hand reached out toward me. Thank you, she whispered. You saved me. Guilt hit like a physical blow. This wasn't supposed to feel real. She was supposed to be a means to an end, the vulnerable point in a monster's armor that I'd exploit without emotional complication. But her small voice saying thank you, her father's face when he'd thought she was dying, the terrible weight of what had actually just happened all collided in my chest until breathing hurt. You're welcome, sweetheart. Be more careful near water, okay? Luca was watching me with an intensity that felt like being dissected. I need your name. It wasn't a request. This was a man accustomed to demanding information and receiving it immediately. Refusing would seem suspicious, would paint me as someone with reasons to avoid his attention. The whole point of this operation was to become someone he noticed, someone he'd want to keep close. Vera Sokolova. He repeated it, testing the syllables. Russian? Mother's side. She emigrated in the 80s. You saved my daughter's life, Vera Sokolova. His voice dropped lower, carrying weight that made the words feel like contracts being signed. I don't forget debts. Ever. In my world, that kind of obligation is permanent. This was it. The opening I'd spent 2 years planning for. I needed to play this carefully. Establish myself as someone selfless and humble. Someone who'd done the right thing without expectation of reward. Make him want to repay me, want to bring me closer, want to trust me enough that I could eventually destroy him. I don't need repayment, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady despite cold and shock, and the horrible awareness that I was lying to a man holding a child I'd just saved. I'm just glad she's safe. Anyone would have done the same thing. No. His certainty was absolute. Most people wouldn't. Most people don't act. They observe and hope someone else handles crisis. You didn't hesitate. That matters. A security guard approached with blankets, expensive wool that Luca immediately wrapped around my shoulders before attending to his daughter. The gesture was unexpectedly gentle, at odds with everything I knew about his capacity for violence. He was a man who'd killed my sister, who ran criminal enterprises built on human suffering, who'd destroyed lives without apparent conscience. But the hands wrapping a blanket around a stranger's shoulders were careful, almost reverent. I've never owed anyone, he continued, his attention split between me and Chiara. Built everything I have without debts I couldn't immediately repay. But I owe you everything. My daughter's life. That's not something I can balance with money or favors. It's permanent obligation. The weight of his words settled over me like the blanket, warm and suffocating simultaneously. This was what I'd wanted, what I'd planned for. Access to his world through gratitude and obligation. But standing there in wet clothes, looking at a 5-year-old who'd nearly died, facing a father's genuine terror, I felt the first crack in the certainty that had sustained me through 2 years of preparation. I understand debts, I heard myself saying, and I understand family. Make sure she's checked by a doctor, keep her warm, watch for signs of shock. That's payment enough. His smile was slight, barely visible, but it changed his face completely, made him look younger, less dangerous, almost approachable. You'll hear from me, Vera Sokolova. Count on it. He turned to leave, security detail forming protective cordon around him and Kiara. But after 3 steps he paused, glancing back over his shoulder with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What you did today, jumping into cold water to save a stranger's child? That took courage most people don't possess. Remember that about yourself." Then they were gone, moving toward waiting vehicles with the coordinated efficiency of military extraction. I stood alone on the plaza, wrapped in a blanket that probably cost more than my monthly rent, watching the man who'd killed my sister disappear into New York traffic while his daughter waved goodbye from the car window. My hired distraction approached cautiously, fake camera in hand, confusion evident on his face. "What happened?" I was about to start the scene, but then there were cops and everyone was running and change of plans. I cut him off. "You're done. Take your payment and forget you were ever here." He left quickly, sensing the shift in atmosphere that suggested asking questions would be hazardous to his health. I waited until the area had mostly cleared, tourists and locals drifting away now that the crisis had resolved into Saturday morning normalcy. Then I allowed myself to acknowledge what had actually happened. Kiara's fall hadn't been part of my plan. The timing was wrong, the circumstances too convenient, the distraction of security too perfect. Someone else had orchestrated that near drowning, someone with resources to interfere with professional security, with motivation to see Luca Moretti's daughter dead, with planning sophisticated enough to make it look accidental in a public space. I'd just saved the child I'd been planning to use as leverage from someone else's assassination attempt. Had accidentally interfered with a plot I hadn't known existed, and in doing so, I'd inserted myself into Luca Moretti's life in exactly the way I'd intended, but through circumstances that suggested his world was more complicated and more dangerous than even my intelligence files had revealed. The walk back to my apartment took 40 minutes, time I used to process implications and adjust plans. Someone wanted Kiara dead, someone with capabilities that matched or exceeded the security Luca Moretti employed. That suggested internal threat or rival organization with significant intelligence about his routines and vulnerabilities. It suggested Luca had enemies powerful enough to target his daughter, despite the certain retaliation such an attack would provoke. It also meant my insertion into his life would be more dangerous than anticipated. I'd planned to play the role of grateful friend, trusted companion, someone who'd proven her character through selfless action. But if there were active threats against Kiara, Luca would investigate me thoroughly, would subject my carefully constructed identity to scrutiny designed to detect any weakness or deception. One mistake, one inconsistency in my background, and I wouldn't simply be discovered and dismissed. I'd be disappeared, become another body that New York City swallowed without explanation or investigation. My apartment was a 4th-floor walk-up in Prospect Heights, deliberately modest but not so poor as to suggest desperation. 1 bedroom, updated kitchen, decent neighborhood that attracted young professionals and artists. Exactly the kind of place a freelance translator would live. Respectable enough to suggest success, humble enough to avoid questions about excessive income. I stripped off my wet clothes immediately, leaving them in a heap on the bathroom floor while I stood under water as hot as I could tolerate. The cold from conservatory water had settled deep in my bones, but it wasn't just physical temperature I was trying to wash away. Kiara's small arms around my neck, her frightened gasps as she'd coughed up water, her father's face transformed by terror into something almost human. Those sensations clung like the smell of pond water, impossible to entirely remove. This was supposed to be simple. Identify target, create opportunity, insert myself into his life, gather intelligence, orchestrate destruction. Clinical process I'd executed variations of during my intelligence career, but standing under scalding water, I couldn't stop remembering how small she'd felt when I'd pulled her from the water, how genuine Luca's fear had been, how my guilt felt more overwhelming than satisfaction at having successfully initiated contact. I needed to remember why I was doing this. Anya's face, bright and laughing in my last clear memory of her, 26 years old with her whole life ahead of her, passionate about justice and truth and making the world better through careful investigation and fearless reporting. She died alone in her apartment, frightened and helpless, murdered by people who valued profit over human life. Luca Moretti had ordered her death to protect his operations. That truth couldn't be obscured by his capacity for fatherly love or the vulnerability of his daughter. But doubt had taken root, small but persistent. What if I was wrong? What What if the intelligence I'd gathered over 2 years of obsessive investigation had gaps or inaccuracies? What if the man who'd looked at me with such focused intensity wasn't the simple monster I'd constructed in my imagination? I shut off the water before such thoughts could develop further. Doubt was luxury I couldn't afford. Anya deserved justice, and I was the only person positioned to deliver it. Everything else, guilt, uncertainty, the uncomfortable awareness that Kiara was an innocent child, had to be secondary to that purpose. My phone rang as I was toweling off, unknown number with New York area code. I let it go to voicemail, waiting to see if the caller would leave a message. They did. Male voice, professional tone, brief message that made my pulse quicken. Miss Sokolova, this is Vincent Castellano calling on behalf of Mr. Moretti. He would like to speak with you regarding this morning's events. Please call at your earliest convenience. He rattled off a number I immediately recognized from my surveillance files as Luca's private line, the one reserved for personal rather than business calls. 8 hours. That's how long it had taken for him to track down my contact information and reach out. Faster than expected, but not surprising given his resources. I'd deliberately made myself findable, left just enough digital footprint that someone with access to databases and investigation capabilities would locate me without excessive difficulty. But not so obvious that it seemed intentional. I waited 30 minutes before returning the call, long enough to suggest I hadn't been desperately awaiting contact, but short enough to indicate interest and courtesy. The line connected on the second ring. Vera Sokolova? His voice deeper and more intimate through the phone than it had been in person. Thank you for calling back. Is Kiara okay? Did the doctor find any problems? Leading with concern for his daughter, establishing that my priority was her well-being rather than whatever he might offer. That was the character I needed him to believe. Selfless woman who'd acted on instinct without calculation or expectation of benefit. She's fine. Mild hypothermia, some water in her lungs that's already clearing. Dr. Castellano says she'll make a complete recovery thanks to your quick action and proper technique. Pause. Waited with meaning I couldn't quite interpret. I need to see you. Talk in person about what happened and what comes next. What comes next? Phrasing that suggested he'd been thinking about me, about implications and obligations and how to respond to unprecedented debt. Exactly what I'd hoped for. That's not necessary. I'm just glad she's safe. It's very necessary. No room for argument in his tone. Tomorrow afternoon, I'll send a car to your address at 2 o'clock. We'll have tea, talk somewhere private. You'll meet Kiara again in a context where she's not traumatized and you're not freezing. He had my address. Of course he did. Probably had my entire background by now. Or as much of my carefully constructed identity as investigation could reveal. This was the test. Agree to meet him on his territory. Subject myself to whatever scrutiny he deemed appropriate. And either my cover would hold, or I'd be exposed. All right, I agreed. As if this was significant concession rather than exactly what I'd planned for. 2 o'clock tomorrow. Should I bring anything? His laugh was dark, amused in ways I couldn't quite parse. Just yourself, Miss Sokolova. That's all I require. The call ended, leaving me standing in my small apartment holding a phone and feeling the weight of commitments I'd just made. Tomorrow I'd enter Luca Moretti's personal territory, meet him without the chaos of crisis, face whatever questions he'd devised during hours spent investigating the woman who'd saved his daughter's life. This was what I'd worked toward for 2 years. Access to his world, opportunity to get close, foundation for the kind of trust that would eventually let me destroy everything he valued. I should have felt triumphant, satisfied that months of planning had achieved the crucial first breakthrough. Instead, I felt uneasy, uncertain in ways that had nothing to do with operational security, and everything to do with the expression on Luca's face when he'd held his daughter. The way he'd wrapped a blanket around my shoulders with unexpected gentleness, the weight in his voice when he'd said some debts were permanent. I'd expected a monster, clean-cut villain whose destruction would feel like justice and victory. But the man I'd met today was more complicated. Capable of violence, certainly, but also capable of love, of fear, of gratitude that seemed genuine rather than calculated. That complexity threatened to undermine the simple narrative I'd been telling myself for 2 years. I needed to stay focused, remember what I'd lost, what Anya would never have, what this man had taken from my family without apparent remorse. Tomorrow I'd walk into his home, meet his daughter again, begin the slow process of becoming someone he trusted enough to confide in. And eventually, when I'd gathered everything I needed, I'd take it all away from him. Watch him lose everything like Anya had lost everything. Deliver the kind of justice that legal systems couldn't or wouldn't provide. That was the plan. That was why I'd spent 2 years preparing. Why I'd sacrificed my career and constructed an entirely new identity. Why I'd waited patiently for the perfect opportunity. Nothing that happened today changed the fundamental truth. Luca Moretti had destroyed my family, and I was going to return the favor, even if the child with pink rain boots and wind chime laughter made my chest hurt in ways revenge wasn't supposed to complicate. Even if the man who'd looked at me like I'd given him back the sun made me wonder what other parts of the story I might have wrong. The car that arrived at 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon was exactly what I'd expected. Black Mercedes sedan with tinted windows and a driver who introduced himself as Vincent, with the kind of polite efficiency that suggested he was more bodyguard than chauffeur. He opened the rear door without unnecessary conversation, and I climbed into leather interior that smelled like expensive cologne and old money. The drive from Brooklyn to Luca's estate in Westchester took 45 minutes through Sunday traffic. Time I spent reviewing everything I knew about the man I was about to face on his own territory. Luca Moretti, 39 years old, had inherited his father's criminal empire at 26 when Salvatore Moretti suffered a convenient heart attack that federal investigators suspected involved poison, but could never prove. He'd spent the 13 years since consolidating power, eliminating rivals, and building an organization that controlled everything from shipping contracts at New York harbors to high-end art smuggling through legitimate gallery fronts. My intelligence files described him as ruthless, calculating and completely without conscience when business required violence. He'd ordered at least 17 confirmed kills according to FBI estimates, though the actual number was likely significantly higher. He laundered money through a network of restaurants and construction companies, owned judges and police officials at every level of city government, and maintained such tight operational security that federal prosecutors had never managed to build a case that would survive courtroom scrutiny. This was the man who'd killed my sister. And in approximately 30 minutes, I'd be sitting in his home drinking tea, pretending I was simply a good Samaritan who'd happened to save his daughter's life. The estate appeared gradually as we turned off the main road onto a private drive lined with mature oak trees. High stone walls topped with discreet security cameras, wrought iron gates that opened automatically as our car approached, manicured grounds that suggested a staff of professional landscapers maintained the illusion of pastoral elegance. The house itself was a masterpiece of understated wealth, Georgian architecture in gray stone, tall windows that would flood interior rooms with natural light, wide steps leading to an entrance that spoke of old money and careful preservation. Nothing about it screamed organized crime. It looked like the kind of home that might belong to a successful investment banker or corporate executive, someone whose fortune came from legitimate sources and legal enterprise. That careful respectability was part of Luca's genius, I knew. He'd worked hard to distance himself from the theatrical violence and obvious criminality that had characterized his father's generation. Modern organized crime succeeded through invisibility and integration, not flashy displays that attracted attention. Vincent pulled the car to a stop at the entrance, then came around to open my door with the same polite efficiency. "Mr. Moretti is expecting you in the conservatory. I'll escort you." I'd dressed carefully for this meeting, not too formal, which would suggest I was intimidated or trying too hard to impress, not too casual, which might indicate disrespect for the invitation. Dark jeans, silk blouse in deep green, leather jacket that was nice but not expensive, minimal jewelry. The appearance of someone comfortable in her own skin, confident without being arrogant, approachable without seeming desperate for approval. The interior of the house matched the exterior's elegant restraint. Hardwood floors polished to a mirror shine, artwork that looked original and carefully selected, furniture that balanced comfort with aesthetic consideration. We passed through a marble foyer where a grand staircase curved upward toward the second floor, then down a hallway lined with photographs that showed Chiara at various ages. Her development from infant to the 5-year-old I'd pulled from the water documented in professional portraits and candid snapshots. No photographs of her mother, I noticed. No indication that Luca shared this space with anyone except his daughter and whatever staff maintained the household. That aligned with what my research had revealed. Chiara's mother had died in childbirth, and Luca had never remarried or been publicly linked with romantic partners. His entire existence seemed to revolve around his daughter and his business, with no space for complications that might create vulnerability or distraction. The conservatory was at the rear of the house, a sun-filled room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking gardens that probably looked stunning in spring, but currently showed autumn's decay. Luca stood near a table set for tea, wearing dark slacks and a sweater that made him look more approachable than the leather jacket and commanding presence from yesterday. He turned as Vincent announced my arrival, and I felt the full weight of his attention focus on me, with an intensity that made breathing slightly more difficult. "Vera, thank you for coming." He crossed the room to greet me, offering his hand in a gesture that felt more personal than professional. "I hope the drive wasn't too inconvenient." "Not at all. Your driver was very professional." I shook his hand, noting calluses that confirmed what I'd observed yesterday. This wasn't a man who delegated all physical work to subordinates. "How is Chiara? Has she recovered fully? See for yourself." He gestured toward the doorway, where a small figure appeared as if on cue. Chiara looked completely different from the terrified, waterlogged child I'd rescued 24 hours earlier. She wore a pink dress that matched her ever-present rain boots, her dark hair in careful braids, her face bright with excitement as she ran across the room toward me. "You came! Papa said you might not come, but you did." She stopped just short of crashing into my legs, suddenly shy. I wanted to say thank you properly, for saving me from drowning. The guilt that had been a constant weight since yesterday intensified. I crouched to her eye level, forcing myself to smile despite the emotional complexity of this moment. "You're very welcome, sweetie. I'm so glad you're okay. No more leaning over water, right?" "Right. Papa said I have to be more careful because the world is dangerous, and people who love me worry when I'm not safe." She spoke with the careful pronunciation of a child, repeating lessons she'd been taught. "Are you staying for tea?" Mrs. Chen made cookies. "I am staying for tea. And cookies sound wonderful." Luca watched this exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read, something soft and assessing simultaneously. When Chiara ran off to help Mrs. Chen, presumably the housekeeper, bring refreshments, he gestured for me to sit in one of the comfortable chairs arranged around the tea table. "She's been talking about you nonstop since yesterday," he said, settling into the chair across from mine. "The lady who saved her? The brave lady who wasn't afraid of cold water. You've become something of a hero in her imagination. I just did what anyone would do. We've established that's not true." His tone was gentle but firm. "Most people freeze in crisis situations. Even trained professionals sometimes hesitate when confronted with immediate danger. You didn't. That suggests either exceptional character or professional training." Probably both. This was it. The interrogation I'd been expecting, dressed up as polite conversation over tea. I needed to navigate carefully, provide enough truth to satisfy his curiosity without revealing anything that would connect me to Anya or expose my real purpose. "I told you yesterday. Lifeguard certification in college. Crisis training teaches you to act without overthinking. Lifeguard certification." He repeated it the same way he'd repeated my name yesterday, testing for inconsistencies. "At which college?" "Boston University. I studied languages and spent summers working at a community pool in Dorchester. Saved 3 people over 4 summers, though none as dramatic as yesterday." It was all true. Part of my actual background that I'd incorporated into Vera Sokolova's identity. The best cover stories were built on foundations of truth, complicated enough to resist casual investigation, while avoiding easily disproven fabrications. Languages. Which ones? Russian, obviously. Also Italian, French, and conversational Arabic. I work as a freelance translator now, mostly technical documents and business contracts. Boring, but pays the bills. Mrs. Chen arrived with a tea service that looked like it belonged in a museum. Delicate porcelain painted with intricate designs, accompanied by a selection of cookies that were clearly homemade. Chiara helped distribute napkins with serious concentration, playing hostess in a way that suggested she'd been coached on proper etiquette. Luca poured tea with surprising grace for a man with his reputation for violence, adding precisely the amount of sugar and cream I indicated without seeming to calculate or judge. "Freelance translation. That's interesting work. Do you specialize in any particular industry?" "Whatever pays. I've done technical manuals for manufacturing companies, legal documents for immigration firms, marketing materials for tourism agencies, Variety keeps it from getting too monotonous. And you're not currently employed full-time by any agency or organization? The questions felt casual, but I recognized interrogation technique. He was establishing my background, looking for gaps or inconsistencies that might indicate I was more than I claimed. This was expected. Someone in his position didn't survive by trusting strangers who appeared conveniently in his daughter's life. No, I prefer the flexibility of freelance work. After my mother died 2 years ago, I didn't want to be locked into office schedules or corporate demands. Independence seemed more valuable than stability. His expression shifted slightly at the mention of my mother's death. Something that might have been sympathy, though it was difficult to read genuine emotion, in a man who'd spent decades perfecting the art of controlling what others could perceive. I'm sorry for your loss. Losing parents is difficult regardless of age or circumstance. Thank you. She had cancer. Long illness that gave us time to say goodbye, which is more than many people get. I sipped the tea, which was excellent, and watched Kiara carefully select a cookie from the plate. What about you? Is Kiara's mother? I let the question trail off, playing the role of someone who wanted to understand the family dynamics without prying too aggressively into painful subjects. She died during childbirth, complications that developed too quickly for doctors to address effectively. His hand moved unconsciously to touch Kiara's head as she sat beside his chair, a gesture that spoke of deep protective instinct. I've raised Kiara alone since birth. Not ideal, but we manage. You seem to be doing an excellent job. She's clearly loved and well cared for. I do my best. Though yesterday reminded me how quickly everything can change, how vulnerable even the most careful precautions can be to unexpected circumstances. There was weight in those words that went beyond ordinary parental concern. He was thinking about the fact that his daughter had nearly died despite extensive security, that someone had been skilled or lucky enough to create an opportunity for tragedy despite all his resources and planning. This was my opening. The moment to establish myself as someone who understood danger and could be trusted in crisis situations. Can I ask you something? I set down my teacup, meeting his eyes directly. Yesterday, when I pulled Kiara out of the water, your security seemed distracted. There was commotion on the other side of the plaza, and the guards who should have been watching her were focused elsewhere. Was that normal? His expression hardened almost imperceptibly. That dangerous edge I'd read about in intelligence files suddenly visible beneath the veneer of cultured hospitality. You're very observant. I notice patterns. Part of what makes me good at translation work. Languages are all about recognizing patterns and connections that others might miss. And what patterns did you notice yesterday? I chose my words carefully, aware that I was walking a narrow line between seeming helpful and revealing too much about my own investigative capabilities. The distraction seemed coordinated. Time to pull attention away from Kiara right when she wandered toward the water. If I were paranoid, I'd wonder if someone created that situation intentionally. And if you were paranoid, what conclusion would you draw? That someone wanted to hurt your daughter and make it look accidental? That the security breach wasn't coincidental, but orchestrated by people who understood your routines and knew how to exploit them? Silence stretched between us, heavy with implications. Chiara continued eating her cookie, oblivious to the tension that had developed in the adult conversation. Luca's eyes never left my face, assessing whether I was genuinely perceptive or revealing knowledge I shouldn't possess. That's a disturbing theory, he said finally. What makes you think I'm important enough that someone would orchestrate such an elaborate attack? I don't know who you are beyond what you've told me. But this house, the security detail, the way people respond to you, all of it suggests someone with resources and enemies. I grew up in Brooklyn. I know what organized crime looks like, even when it wears expensive suits and lives in Westchester estates. The honesty was calculated risk. Pretending complete ignorance would insult his intelligence and make me seem naive or dishonest. Acknowledging that I recognized his world while maintaining that I wasn't directly involved was the more credible position. And does that concern you? Knowing that accepting my invitation might connect you to dangerous people? Should it? I held his gaze, refusing to look away first. You seem dangerous yourself, but you've been nothing but courteous to me. Your daughter is sweet and innocent. Whatever else you might be involved in, that's your business. I'm here because a child asked to see me and because you invited me to tea. Nothing more complicated than that? He smiled, genuine amusement breaking through the dangerous assessment. You're either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. I haven't decided which. Maybe both. Tends to go together in my experience. Kiara tugged on her father's sleeve, interrupting the moment before it could develop further. Papa, can Vera see my room? I want to show her my books. She likes languages, and I have books in Italian that Nonna sent. Luca glanced at me, a question in his expression. I nodded, sensing that refusing would seem suspicious or rude. I'd love to see your room. The next hour passed in surprisingly pleasant domesticity. Kiara's room was a child's paradise of carefully organized toys, books in multiple languages, and artwork that covered the walls in colorful chaos. She showed me her favorite picture books, demonstrated her ability to count to 20 in Italian, and explained in great detail the complex social hierarchy of her stuffed animal collection. Luca watched from the doorway, that same unreadable expression on his face. I caught him studying me several times when he thought I was focused entirely on his daughter, and I wondered what conclusions he was drawing. Whether he trusted me or suspected me, whether I'd passed whatever test this afternoon had represented or failed in ways I hadn't recognized. When Kiara finally wound down, exhausted from her enthusiastic tour, Luca suggested she rest while he walked me back to where Vincent was waiting with the car. We moved through the house in comfortable silence, the afternoon light slanting through tall windows and creating patterns on the polished floors. I have a proposition for you, he said as we reached the foyer. Kiara needs a tutor. She's homeschooled currently, but she needs someone who can teach languages, literature, art. Someone patient and kind who can handle a bright 5-year-old with endless questions. My heart rate accelerated even as I kept my expression neutral. This was exactly what I'd hoped for. Access to his home, regular contact, opportunity to learn the details of his life and operations. But I couldn't seem too eager, couldn't accept immediately without appropriate hesitation. I don't have formal teaching credentials. Wouldn't you want someone with educational background? I want someone my daughter trusts. Someone who's already proven capable of protecting her when circumstances required immediate action. Credentials matter less than character in my world. And you think you know my character after one afternoon? I think I know enough. The rest we'll discover together. He pulled a business card from his pocket, expensive cardstock with embossed lettering. Think about it. The position would pay well, and you'd have flexibility with your freelance work. Kiara needs lessons 3 days a week, 2 hours each session. You could start next week if you're interested. I took the card, feeling its weight in my palm like a contract being signed. What if I'm not who you think I am? What if letting me close to your daughter is a mistake? Then I'll deal with the consequences. I'm very good at dealing with consequences, Vera. His smile didn't reach his eyes, that dangerous edge visible again beneath the surface courtesy. But I don't think you're a threat to Kiara. You risked your life to save hers. Whatever else you might be, you're not someone who'd hurt an innocent child. The guilt was overwhelming now, crushing weight on my chest that made breathing difficult. He was right. I'd never hurt Kiara, but I fully intended to hurt him. To destroy everything he'd built. To take away the life and security he'd created for his daughter. That would hurt her too. Collateral damage in my quest for revenge against the man who'd killed Anya. I'll think about it, I managed to say. Give me a couple days? Of course. Take whatever time you need. Vincent will drive you home. The ride back to Brooklyn passed in a blur, my mind racing through implications and adjustments to my plan. I'd achieved the primary objective. Luca Moretti had invited me into his home, offered me regular access to his life, created the perfect foundation for the kind of long-term infiltration I'd been planning. This was success beyond what I'd dared hope for after just one meeting. So why did I feel like I'd just made a terrible mistake? My apartment felt smaller when I returned, the modest space that had seemed adequate suddenly feeling confining after hours in Luca's elegant estate. I paced between the kitchen and living area, reviewing every moment of the afternoon, analyzing every word and gesture for hidden meaning or warning signs I might have missed. He knew I was perceptive. That was clear from his questions about the security breach. He'd tested me with that conversation, gauged whether I was simply observant or possessed knowledge that would indicate prior investigation. I thought I'd walked that line successfully, presented myself as naturally analytical without revealing my intelligence background. But Luca Moretti hadn't survived 13 years atop New York's criminal hierarchy by being careless or easily deceived. He would investigate me further. Probably was already having his people dig deeper into Vera Sokolova's background. My cover would hold. I'd made certain of that. But the scrutiny itself was dangerous, increased the risk that some small detail might not align perfectly with the story I'd constructed. The bigger problem was Chiara. I'd expected a spoiled mafia princess, a child corrupted by wealth and proximity to violence, someone I could use without excessive guilt, because she was already tainted by her father's choices. But the reality was far more complicated. She was sweet, intelligent, completely innocent in ways that made my planned revenge feel monstrous. If I destroyed Luca, what happened to her? She'd lose her father, her home, her security. She'd grow up knowing that the woman she'd trusted as a tutor had orchestrated the destruction of her entire world. That kind of betrayal would damage her in ways that might never heal. But what about Anya? My sister had been innocent too. 26 years old with her whole future ahead of her, passionate about justice and exposing criminals who operated with impunity. She died alone and frightened, murdered by people who valued their illegal profits over human life. Didn't she deserve justice? Didn't her death demand consequences? I called Emily that evening, needing to hear a friendly voice, someone connected to my real life rather than the constructed identity I was inhabiting. Sophia, God, I haven't heard from you in days. How are you? How's work? The name jarred me for a moment before I remembered. Emily knew me by my real name, Sophia Kozlov, not the Vera Sokolova identity I'd created. I'd been so deep in character that hearing my actual name felt strange, like being reminded of a person I used to be before revenge became my entire existence. I'm fine, just busy with new translation contracts. How's your mom? Still recovering well? She's amazing. Physical therapy is going great, and the doctors say she'll make full recovery. Sophia, I still don't know how to thank you for arranging payment of the medical bills. That anonymous benefactor story doesn't fool me. I know it was you. Guilt twisted in my chest. It hadn't been me. It had been Luca, making good on his assessment that Emily's mother deserved help. The man I was planning to destroy had casually solved a financial crisis that would have bankrupted Emily's family, and I was receiving credit for his generosity. Just glad she's doing better. That's what matters. We talked for 20 more minutes about ordinary things. Emily's job as a social worker, her frustrating dating life, neighborhood gossip that felt both familiar and distant. When I finally ended the call, I felt worse rather than better. Emily represented normal life. The person I used to be before Anya's death transformed me into someone capable of elaborate revenge schemes and identity construction. Could I go back to that person? If I succeeded in destroying Luca, if I achieved the justice I'd spent 2 years pursuing, could I return to being Sophia Kozlov who cared about translation work and book clubs and normal human connections? Or had the quest for revenge already changed me too fundamentally for such simple existence? The answer felt obvious and depressing. I'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, built an entire false identity, infiltrated a criminal organization, planned to manipulate a grieving father through his love for his daughter. Those weren't actions that normal people took. They were the methods of intelligence operatives and criminals, people who'd accepted that conventional morality was luxury they couldn't afford. I'd become the kind of person Anya would have been horrified to know. My sister had believed in justice through legal systems, in exposing criminals through careful journalism that provided evidence for prosecutors. She would never have approved of this extra-legal revenge mission, would have argued that becoming like the people we opposed meant they'd already won. But Anya was dead. And her faith in legal justice had died with her when police accepted the staged suicide without serious investigation. The system she'd trusted had failed her completely, more interested in closing cases than pursuing truth. So I'd stopped believing in systems and started believing in direct action. 3 days passed before I called the number on Luca's business card. 3 days of internal debate, reviewing plans, and confronting uncomfortable questions about who I'd become and whether the cost of revenge was worth what I'd have to sacrifice. In the end, the decision was inevitable. I'd spent 2 years preparing for this opportunity. Abandoning the mission now would mean Anya's death remained unavenged. Her murderer continued operating with impunity, and all my sacrifice had been pointless. I couldn't live with that. Moretti residence. Professional female voice, probably the housekeeper, Mrs. Chen. This is Vera Sokolova. I'm calling about the tutoring position Mr. Moretti offered. One moment, please. The hold music was classical. Something by Vivaldi, if I recognized correctly. Then Luca's voice, deeper and more intimate through the phone than in person. Vera, I was hoping you'd call. I've thought about your offer. If the position is still available, I'd like to accept, with some conditions. Conditions? Amusement in his tone. I'm listening. I need flexibility for my translation work. Some projects have tight deadlines that might occasionally conflict with tutoring schedule. And I want to be clear that my role is educational only. I'm not household staff, not security, not involved in any other aspect of your business or personal life. Understood and agreed. When can you start? Monday. That gives me this week to organize my current projects and prepare curriculum ideas for Kiara. Monday is perfect. Come at 9. We'll discuss specifics over breakfast. Then you can have your first session with Kiara. The call ended, leaving me standing in my kitchen holding a phone and feeling the weight of commitment I'd just made. This was it. The point of no return. I'd officially accepted a position in Luca Moretti's household, gained access to his private life, created the foundation for everything I'd been planning. Now I just had to maintain the deception long enough to gather what I needed. Learn his operations, identify his vulnerabilities, collect evidence that would allow me to destroy him systematically and completely, all while pretending to be a kind tutor who cared about his daughter's education and had no ulterior motives beyond earning a paycheck. Simple. If I could ignore the guilt that threatened to overwhelm me every time I thought about Kiara's trusting smile, if I could forget that Luca had looked at me with something that might have been genuine gratitude and respect, if I could maintain the rage that had sustained me through 2 years of planning despite growing evidence that the simple narrative of monster and victim might be more complicated than I'd wanted to believe. Spent the weekend preparing. Curriculum outlines for language instruction appropriate to a 5-year-old. Reading lists that would introduce classic literature through age-appropriate stories. Art projects that would develop creativity and fine motor skills. All the things a dedicated tutor would create for a gifted student. But I also reviewed everything I knew about Luca's operations. The shipping companies that moved legitimate cargo alongside illegal contraband. The restaurants that served as money laundering fronts. The art galleries that facilitated smuggling of stolen masterpieces to private collectors. The network of corrupt officials who ensured laws were enforced selectively and investigations died before reaching prosecution. This was the empire I intended to dismantle. These were the operations I'd expose and destroy, ensuring Luca lost everything he'd built on the foundation of my sister's murder. Justice. That's what I told myself I was pursuing. Justice for Anya, who died trying to expose exactly this kind of corruption. Justice for all the victims of Luca's trafficking operations, the people who'd suffered so he could accumulate wealth and power. But late at night, when I couldn't sleep and doubt crept in around the edges of my certainty, I wondered if justice was really what drove me. Or if this was simply revenge dressed up in noble language, personal vendetta I'd rationalized into righteous crusade. The distinction might not matter. Either way, Monday morning I'd walk back into Luca Moretti's home and begin the process of destroying him from the inside. Either way, a 5-year-old girl who'd done nothing wrong would eventually pay the price for her father's sins and my need for retribution. Either way, there was no going back. Monday morning arrived with October sunlight that felt too cheerful for the deception I was about to embrace. I dressed carefully in clothing appropriate for teaching a 5-year-old while maintaining professional credibility. Dark pants, cream sweater, minimal jewelry, the appearance of someone focused on education rather than infiltration. Vincent arrived at 8:30 to drive me to the estate. Same professional efficiency that suggested he'd transported countless people for countless purposes without developing curiosity about any of them. The drive passed in silence, broken only by classical music playing at low volume through the car's sound system. The house looked different in morning light, less imposing and more like an actual home where people lived, rather than a fortress designed to keep the world at carefully controlled distance. Luca met me at the entrance himself rather than having staff handle my arrival, wearing jeans and a dark sweater that made him look younger and more approachable than the dangerous crime boss I knew him to be. Vera, welcome. He offered his hand, and I shook it, noting again the calluses that suggested regular physical work beyond signing documents and making phone calls. Kiara's been awake since dawn, asking when you'd arrive. I hope you're prepared for enthusiasm. I've worked with children before. Enthusiasm is usually a good sign. He led me through the house toward what he called the morning room, a sun-filled space with comfortable furniture and large windows overlooking gardens, where autumn flowers still bloomed despite cooling temperatures. Breakfast had been laid out on a sideboard, an impressive spread that suggested Mrs. Chen had been cooking since early morning. Help yourself. Luca gestured toward the food. We can discuss expectations and schedule while we eat. Then you'll have Kiara for your first session. I selected fruit and toast, appetite suppressed by nervousness that had nothing to do with the teaching job, and everything to do with maintaining deception under close observation. Luca sat across from me with coffee, and what appeared to be an Italian breakfast of pastry and cheese, watching me with that same assessing intensity I'd come to recognize as his default expression. Before we begin, I need you to understand something about my world. His tone was serious, the casual warmth from our entrance greeting replaced by harder edge. I'm not a legitimate businessman. You've already figured that out, demonstrated by your comment about recognizing organized crime. What you teach my daughter happens in one sphere of her life. What I do to provide for her happens in another. Those spheres don't touch, ever. I understand. Do you? Because accepting this position means accepting certain realities. You'll see things, hear things, observe details about my life and business that most people don't access. That knowledge makes you either part of my world or a threat to it. There's no middle ground. This was the warning I'd expected eventually. The moment where Luca established boundaries and gauged my reaction to implicit threats. I needed to acknowledge the danger without seeming intimidated, show that I understood the stakes while maintaining that I had no interest in his criminal operations. I'm here to teach languages and literature to a 5-year-old girl who deserves the best education her father can provide. Whatever else happens in this house is your business, not mine. I won't ask questions, won't repeat what I might accidentally observe, won't become a problem you need to solve. Is that clear enough? His expression shifted slightly, approval mixed with continued assessment. Very clear. And in exchange for your discretion and excellent teaching, you'll be compensated well and protected from complications that might arise from association with my household. Protected from what complications? People who might try to use you to get to me or Kiara. Rivals who might see you as weakness they can exploit. Law enforcement who might pressure you for information. He sipped his coffee, completely casual while discussing scenarios that involved kidnapping and federal investigation. As long as you work for me, you're under my protection. That means no one touches you without answering to me. The possessiveness in his tone sent uncomfortable warmth through my chest that I immediately tried to suppress. This wasn't about me personally. This was about protecting his assets, maintaining control over everyone in his orbit. I couldn't mistake professional security for personal interest. And when I stop working for you, then we part as friends with mutual respect and continued discretion. I don't make enemies of people who've been loyal and helpful. Bad for business and worse for my conscience. Conscience. Interesting word choice for a man who'd killed at least 17 people according to FBI estimates. But I simply nodded, filing away this glimpse into how he rationalized his actions. Luca saw himself as someone with ethical principles. Just principles that operated outside legal frameworks most people accepted as absolute. Kiara burst into the room before our conversation could continue, her entrance accompanied by the sound of running feet and breathless excitement. Vera, you came. Papa said you'd be here for breakfast and then we could start lessons, and I've been ready since forever. The shift from dangerous mob boss to indulgent father was instantaneous and complete. Luca's entire demeanor softened as he caught his daughter mid-launch, pulling her into his lap with practiced ease. Tesoro, what did we discuss about interrupting adult conversations? That I should wait politely and not burst in like a tornado. She looked appropriately chastened for approximately 3 seconds before her attention shifted back to me. But Vera's here for me, so technically it's not interrupting. It's just being excited about learning. I couldn't help laughing at the logic, the way she'd found the loophole in her father's instruction, with the kind of clever reasoning that suggested she'd grow up to be formidable, regardless of what path she chose. That's very good negotiating technique. You'll have to teach me how you do that. Papa says negotiating is important. He says knowing what people want and finding ways to give it to them while getting what you want is how adults solve problems. She wiggled down from Luca's lap and came to stand beside my chair. Can we start lessons now? I want to show you I've been practicing Italian counting like you suggested. Luca caught my eye over his daughter's head, something in his expression that might have been amusement or warning. Teaching his daughter negotiating techniques probably wasn't standard parenting practice, but it made perfect sense for someone raising a child in his world. Chiara would need to understand power dynamics and strategic thinking, just to survive the complicated legacy her father would leave her. The next 2 hours passed in surprising pleasure. Chiara was a bright, engaged student with natural aptitude for languages and endless curiosity about everything. We worked through Italian vocabulary using picture books her grandmother had sent, practiced pronunciation that delighted her when I praised her improving accent, and did art projects that combined color theory with cultural education about Italian Renaissance painting. She asked constant questions, observations that showed she was processing information at deeper level than many children her age. When we looked at a reproduction of Botticelli's Birth of Venus, she wanted to know why Venus looked sad, even though she was supposed to be goddess of beauty and love. When I explained that even goddesses could feel complex emotions, she nodded seriously and said that made sense because Papa sometimes looked sad even when he said he was fine. The insight twisted something in my chest. This child noticed her father's pain, worried about his emotional well-being, carried awareness beyond her years because she'd grown up in a household where danger was always present, even when invisible. She was being raised to read people, to notice what they didn't say, to understand that appearances often masked complicated realities, just like I was doing. Pretending to be kind tutor while actually conducting intelligence operation, smiling and teaching, while internally cataloging details about the house's security systems, observing the patterns of staff movement, noting which rooms Luca disappeared into for phone calls that required privacy. When our session ended at 11, Chiara hugged me with unself-conscious affection that made guilt intensify to almost unbearable levels. Will you come back Wednesday? Papa said you'll teach me 3 days every week. That's today, Wednesday, and Friday, right? That's right. You're very good with schedules. Papa says organization is important. He has schedules for everything. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. Sometimes I think he'd put breathing on a schedule if he could. I heard Luca laugh from the doorway where he'd been observing the last few minutes of our session. I heard that, Piccola. And breathing is automatic, so it doesn't need scheduling. See? He even has opinions about hypothetical breathing schedules. Chiara looked at me with exaggerated exasperation that was clearly performed for her father's benefit. This is what I live with. The affection between them was palpable, genuine in ways that completely contradicted the image of cold-blooded criminal I'd constructed during 2 years of obsessive investigation. Luca might be capable of violence and ruthless business practices, but he was also a father who clearly adored his daughter and worked to give her as much normalcy as his world allowed. Mrs. Chen arrived to take Chiara for lunch, leaving me alone with Luca in the sunlit room where we'd spent the morning. He gestured for me to sit while he poured fresh coffee from the carafe that staff had brought without being asked. She adores you already, he observed, handing me a cup prepared exactly how I'd taken it during breakfast. I've never seen her connect with someone so quickly. Usually she's shy around new people, takes weeks to warm up. She's a wonderful student, bright, curious, creative. Teaching her is going to be genuine pleasure, not just work. Good. He settled into the chair across from mine, studying me with that intensity that always made me feel simultaneously exposed and protected. I noticed you observing the house during your session, noting the security cameras, the movement patterns of staff, the rooms that remain locked. Very thorough assessment for someone who's supposedly just here to teach languages. My pulse spiked, even as I kept my expression neutral. Had I been that obvious? Or was Luca simply paranoid enough that he interpreted normal curiosity as surveillance? I notice things. Habit from intelligence work that's hard to break even though I left that career years ago. The lie came smoothly, part of Vera Sokolova's background I'd carefully constructed. Former intelligence analyst with State Department, left due to burnout and disagreements with management, transitioned to freelance translation work that allowed more personal freedom, all documented in employment records I'd created through contacts who specialized in exactly this kind of identity construction. Intelligence work. He repeated it with the same careful testing he'd used for other details of my background. State Department? Analyst position. Nothing exciting, mostly translating intercepted communications and compiling reports that other people used to make actual decisions. I got tired of being 10 steps removed from anything meaningful. And now you teach 5-year-olds Italian. Quite a career change. Now I do work that feels meaningful because I can see the direct impact. Chiara learning a new word, connecting with literature, developing confidence in her abilities, that matters in immediate, tangible ways. Translating terrorist communication so they could sit in classified databases that nobody read didn't feel like contribution. It felt like wasting my skills on bureaucracy. It was all true. Adapted from my actual experience with the private intelligence firm, I had grown frustrated with the distance between analysis and action, the sense that information I gathered rarely translated into meaningful change. That frustration had made it easier to leave when Anya died, and revenge became my primary purpose. Luca nodded slowly, as if this explanation satisfied something he'd been evaluating. I understand that frustration. Working within systems that prioritize procedure over results is suffocating for people who are capable of more direct action. Is that why you work outside the system? Because you found legal frameworks too constraining? The question was bold, pushing boundaries of the professional distance I was supposed to maintain. But I needed to understand him. Needed to find the human motivations beneath the criminal empire if I was going to successfully destroy everything he'd built. I work outside the system because the system is broken, he said, surprising me with his directness. It claims to provide justice and protection, but actually serves whoever has the most money and influence. People like my father understood that reality and built alternative structures to provide what the system wouldn't. Alternative structures. That's an interesting euphemism for organized crime. His smile was sharp. Organized crime is just business that refuses to pretend it's something else. Every corporation exploits workers, manipulates markets, buys political influence. We just don't hide behind charity galas and public relations campaigns. So, you're ethical criminals? Robin Hood mobsters redistributing wealth? No. We're pragmatists who understand that every society has underground economy providing goods and services the official system won't. Someone's going to control that economy. Might as well be people with principles, who take care of their communities, who maintain order. The rationalization was sophisticated. Almost persuasive if you didn't focus on the body count and human suffering his principles had generated. But it gave me insight into how Luca saw himself, not as villain or monster, but as pragmatic businessmen operating in gray areas that existed between legal and illegal, providing services that people wanted despite official prohibition. And killing journalists who threatened to expose your operations? Is that maintaining order? The question escaped before I could stop it. 2 years of rage and grief breaking through my carefully maintained professional facade. Luca's expression hardened immediately, all the casual warmth draining away to reveal the dangerous man beneath. What journalist? His voice was cold now, flat in ways that suggested genuine threat. I'd made a terrible mistake. Revealed too much, let my real purpose show through the cover story I'd constructed so carefully. I needed to recover. Find a way to walk back this exposure before it destroyed everything I'd worked toward. I'm sorry. That was inappropriate. I set down my coffee cup with hands that wanted to shake. When I was with State Department, I saw reports about journalists being killed for investigating organized crime. It's always seemed like cowardly silencing of people trying to expose truth. I shouldn't have brought it up. No, you shouldn't have. He stood, moving to the window with predatory grace that emphasized his physical capability alongside his obvious intelligence. But since you did, I'll be clear. I've never ordered the death of a journalist. I've intimidated them, bribed them, discredited them when necessary. But I don't kill civilians who are simply doing their jobs, no matter how inconvenient their work might be for my operations. Why not? If someone threatens everything you've built, why not eliminate the threat? Because killing journalists attracts attention that's worse than whatever they might publish. Federal investigations, media scrutiny, law enforcement pressure that makes business impossible. Anyone smart enough to survive in my world understands that some problems require different solutions than violence. He turned back to face me, and I saw calculation in his expression that suggested my slip had triggered serious evaluation of my true purposes. Unless you're asking for a specific reason. Unless there's a particular journalist you're concerned about. This was the moment. The decision point where I either committed fully to the deception or confessed everything and accepted whatever consequences followed. Every instinct screamed to run, to abandon this mission before Luca discovered the truth, and I became another person who disappeared without explanation. But I'd come too far. Sacrificed too much. Anya deserved justice, and I was the only person positioned to deliver it. My sister was a journalist, I heard myself say, the truth wrapped in partial lies. She investigated organized crime in Chicago. 3 years ago, she died in what police ruled a suicide. But I never believed it. I've always suspected someone killed her to silence her reporting. The silence that followed was absolute, weighted with implications that could reshape everything between us. Luca studied me with new understanding, pieces obviously clicking into place in his calculating mind. And when you saved my daughter, when you accepted this position, you were looking for what? Evidence that I killed your sister? Confession you could use to finally get justice? No. The truth of that surprised me even as I said it. You're not from Chicago. Your operations don't overlap with the organization she was investigating. I've known since before I accepted this job that you're not responsible for her death. Then why are you really here, Vera Kozlov? The use of my real name sent ice through my veins. Yes, I know who you actually are. Took my people less than 3 days to break through the Vera Sokolova identity and find the real person beneath. Former private intelligence operative who's been conducting surveillance on my organization for 8 months. Sister of Anya Kozlov, journalist who died in Chicago under suspicious circumstances. Woman with every reason to want revenge against someone in my world, even if I'm not specifically responsible for your loss. I stood slowly, assessing exits and calculating odds of successful escape. Vincent would be nearby, probably armed. Other security throughout the house. My chances of getting out alive if Luca decided I was a threat were minimal at best. So what happens now? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Now you tell me the truth. All of it. What you were planning, what you've learned during your surveillance, what you intended to do with information you gathered while posing as my daughter's tutor. He moved closer. Not threatening, but definitely eliminating space between us. And then I decide whether you're someone who can be trusted or someone who needs to disappear. The threat was clear and credible. But something in his expression suggested genuine curiosity alongside the danger. He wanted to understand my motivations. Wanted to know why I'd constructed this elaborate deception. Maybe there was still opportunity to salvage this, to transform exposure into something that served my purposes. I spent 2 years planning to destroy you, I admitted, the honesty feeling both terrifying and liberating. I believed you'd killed Anya to protect your operations. FBI files suggested you controlled trafficking networks she was investigating. I thought if I could get close enough, gather sufficient evidence, I could dismantle your organization and deliver the justice the legal system couldn't provide. Past tense. You believed. You thought, what changed? Kiara fell in the water, and I realized someone else was trying to kill her. That the security breach wasn't coincidental. Then I started digging deeper into your actual operations, and the intelligence didn't align with what I'd assumed. You're not running trafficking networks. I stopped, the realization hitting me with stunning force. You're working against them. The FBI cooperation isn't speculation, it's fact. You've been feeding them intelligence on trafficking operations while pretending to be part of the system. His expression confirmed what I'd just deduced. Very good. Most people never figure that out, but why? Why risk everything to take down organizations that most people in your position would profit from? Because my mother was trafficked. The admission was quiet, heavy with old pain. She was brought to America as a teenager, forced into prostitution, eventually bought by my father who fell in love with her and freed her from that life. She died when I was 12, but not before teaching me that trafficking is the one unforgivable sin. Everything else in this world, drugs, weapons, illegal gambling, those are choices adults make. But trafficking is slavery. It's stealing lives from people who can't defend themselves, and I won't profit from slavery. The pieces were rearranging in my mind. 2 years of assumptions crumbling as I confronted evidence that contradicted everything I'd believed. Then who killed Anya? If you didn't order it, if you were actually trying to stop the trafficking she was investigating, my brother Marco. The name landed like a bomb between us. He's the one actually running trafficking operations in Chicago. He's the one your sister's investigation threatened, and he's the one who had her killed and staged it to look like suicide while framing it to seem like I'd ordered the hit. Your brother. I felt dizzy, the room tilting as implications cascaded through my consciousness. You have a brother who's doing everything I thought you were doing. Had a brother. Past tense. Luca's voice was hard now, carrying satisfaction that suggested violence already delivered. 6 months ago, I gave FBI everything they needed to prosecute him. He's currently serving life sentence in federal prison for human trafficking, murder, racketeering. Your sister's death is one of 17 homicides they connected to him. He'll never see freedom again. I sank back into the chair, legs no longer reliable enough to support me. Everything I'd believed, every assumption that had driven 2 years of planning and preparation, all of it was wrong. I'd been targeting the wrong man. The person actually responsible for Anya's death was already in prison, already paying for his crimes. And the man I'd been planning to destroy was actually fighting against the exact evil my sister had died trying to expose. Why didn't you expose him earlier? If you knew he was running trafficking operations, if you knew he'd killed journalists and trafficking victims, because he had leverage. He had evidence of crimes I committed before I started cooperating with FBI, before I understood what my organization was actually involved in. He threatened to expose me, destroy any legal immunity I'd negotiated, kill Kiara if I moved against him openly. So I worked slowly, carefully, gathering evidence FBI could use while protecting my daughter and maintaining the fiction that I was loyal to family. But 6 months ago, something changed. 6 months ago, Marco tried to have Kiara killed for the first time. That's when I realized no amount of leverage or threats mattered as much as protecting my daughter. So I gave FBI everything. My crimes, Marco's crimes, full cooperation in exchange for immunity and witness protection if needed. They moved fast, arrested him with enough evidence that he couldn't fight it. Case closed. Except it's not closed. I thought about yesterday's security breach, the coordinated distraction that had nearly resulted in Kiara's death. He's still trying to kill her from prison. He has loyalists, people who believe I betrayed the family by cooperating with federal authorities. They're trying to eliminate Kiara as revenge, force me to suffer the way Marco believes he's suffering. Everything suddenly made horrible sense. The reason Luca had investigated me so thoroughly, his warning about spheres of his life not touching, his offer of protection to anyone associated with his household. He wasn't just a paranoid crime boss. He was a father desperately trying to protect his daughter from his own brother's revenge. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate but necessary. I spent 2 years hating you, planning to destroy you, and you weren't even responsible for what I blamed you for. No. But I understand why you blamed me. Marco deliberately left evidence pointing toward me, wanted everyone to believe I'd ordered your sister's death. It served his purposes to keep me looking guilty while he continued operations without interference. How did you figure out I was here under false pretenses? I didn't, not initially. But when you saved Kiara, I had you investigated like I investigate everyone who gets close to my daughter. The Vera Sokolova identity was excellent, probably would have fooled most people, but I have access to resources that most people don't, and I'm paranoid enough to use them thoroughly. It took 3 days to find the connections, the small inconsistencies that suggested constructed background. Once I knew you were Anya Kozlov's sister, the rest was obvious. But you still hired me, still let me into your home, around your daughter, despite knowing I was here to harm you. His smile was complicated, carrying warmth and danger in equal measure. Because I understood your motivation. Because you saved Kiara despite having every reason to let her die. Easiest revenge in the world would have been doing nothing. That told me everything I needed to know about your actual character. Whatever you came here planning, you weren't capable of hurting an innocent child. That made you trustworthy even while being deceptive. I should leave. I stood again, needing to escape this conversation before emotion overwhelmed the fragile control I was maintaining. This position was based on false pretenses. You can't want me teaching your daughter now that you know the truth. Why not? He moved to block my path to the door, not threatening but definitely preventing easy exit. You're still an excellent tutor. Kiara adores you, and now that we both know the truth, there's no deception complicating things. You understand my world, understand the dangers, understand why protection and discretion matter. That makes you more qualified, not less. I tried to destroy you. You tried to get justice for your sister. I respect that. If someone killed Kiara, I'd burn the world to punish them. Your dedication to Anya's memory shows exactly the kind of loyalty and love I value. I looked up at him. This man I'd spent 2 years studying and hating, and saw someone completely different from the monster I'd imagined. Complicated, dangerous, deeply flawed, but also principled in his own way. Devoted to his daughter, fighting against evil even while operating outside legal frameworks. I don't know how to reconcile this, I admitted. 2 years of certainty just shattered. I don't know what to believe anymore. Believe that your sister deserved better than she got. Believe that the person responsible is paying for his crimes. Believe that you saved my daughter twice. Once from drowning, once by not letting hatred overcome your fundamental decency. Everything else we can figure out as we go. His hand touched my face. Gentle despite the calluses I'd noticed from the beginning. The gesture was intimate, charged with something that had been building between us, despite my best efforts to maintain professional distance. This is a terrible idea, I whispered, even as I leaned into his touch. Most of my best decisions start as terrible ideas. His thumb traced my cheekbone, the contact sending warmth through my entire body. Stay, teach Kiara. Let me show you who I actually am instead of who you thought I was. And maybe we can build something honest from the wreckage of deception and misunderstanding. And if I can't, if the guilt and confusion are too much, then you leave with my gratitude and my protection. No threats, no consequences. Just acknowledgement that some situations are too complicated to resolve neatly. But I hope you'll try, because Kiara needs you. And He stopped, seeming to reconsider whatever he'd been about to admit. I'd like the opportunity to earn your trust honestly, without manipulation or deception on either side. The moment stretched between us, heavy with possibility and danger, and something that felt like the beginning of understanding, if not quite forgiveness. Everything I'd believed was wrong, but maybe that meant everything I could believe going forward had potential to be right. I'll stay, I decided, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Not for revenge, not for infiltration, for Kiara, because she deserves the education I can provide, and maybe for you, to understand who you actually are instead of who I thought you were. That's all I'm asking. He stepped back, creating space that allowed breathing and thinking to resume normal patterns. Wednesday session starts at 9. Between now and then, if you have questions about anything, Anya's case, Marco's prosecution, my operations, ask me. No more secrets, no more deception. Complete honesty is the only way this works. I nodded, accepting this new framework for our relationship. Teacher and employer, but also two people who'd found each other through tragedy and misunderstanding, who might be capable of building something genuine from foundation of shared pain and mutual respect. Over the following weeks, a strange routine developed. I taught Kiara 3 mornings a week, watching her language skills flourish under consistent instruction and genuine enthusiasm. She learned Italian verbs and French pronunciation, discovered poetry in multiple languages, created art projects that blended cultural education with creative expression. And I learned about Luca. Not the monster from my intelligence files, but the complicated man who'd inherited a criminal empire and worked to transform it into something less destructive. He showed me evidence of his FBI cooperation, the operations he'd helped dismantle, the trafficking victims who'd been rescued because of intelligence he provided. He explained his philosophy, the ethical lines he wouldn't cross even when operating outside legal frameworks. Marco's loyalists made 2 more attempts on Kiara's life during those weeks. Both failed due to security improvements Luca had implemented and my own heightened awareness of potential threats. After the second attempt, when 3 men tried to breach the estate grounds and I'd helped security team repel them, Luca pulled me into his study with expression I couldn't quite read. You didn't have to engage. Could have stayed with Kiara in the safe room like I'd instructed. They were trying to reach her. Engaging meant drawing them away from her location. Seemed like obvious tactical choice. He'd looked at me then with something that went beyond gratitude or professional respect. You keep saving her, saving us. At what point does the life debt I owe you become impossible to repay? I don't want repayment. I'd stopped, unsure how to articulate the complicated feelings that had developed over weeks of proximity and honest conversation. What do you want, Vera? He'd moved closer. The same charged energy that had been building between us since the day I'd confessed my real purpose. I want this to be real. Not obligation or debt or strategy. Just real. He'd kissed me then, finally, ending weeks of tension with contact that felt like inevitable conclusion to everything that had been building between us. It wasn't gentle or careful. It was desperate, consuming. Two people who'd found each other through the worst possible circumstances, refusing to let those circumstances define what they could become together. That night, after Chiara was asleep and the house was quiet, we came together in Luca's bedroom with intensity born from months of denial and complication. There was nothing simple about the intimacy. It carried weight of everything we'd survived, every misunderstanding we'd overcome, every moment of near loss that had brought us to this point. His hands were reverent despite the hunger in his touch, exploring skin and sensation with focus that made me feel simultaneously cherished and claimed. I responded with equal intensity, needing to prove that this was choice rather than obligation, that my presence in his bed came from genuine desire rather than tactical calculation. "Tell me you want this," he demanded against my throat. Hands mapping territory, I willingly surrendered. "Tell me this is real. It's real. I want this, even though it's insane and complicated and probably going to destroy us both. Then we'll burn together." He lifted me, positioned us with the kind of practiced certainty that came from understanding exactly what he wanted and how to achieve it. "Look at me. I need you to see who's touching you." I met his eyes, storm gray and intense, holding his gaze as we moved together with rhythm that felt like conversation without words. There was emotion in the contact, confession in the way he whispered my name, claim in how his hands held my hips like he'd found something precious he refused to release. When release came, it was mutual and overwhelming, both of us crying from emotion as much as physical sensation. He held me afterward, neither of us speaking, just existing in the space where enemies became lovers, and complicated history transformed into uncertain future. "I love you," he said eventually. The confession simple despite its weight. "I know it's too soon and too complicated, but I love you. The woman who saved my daughter. The enemy who became my salvation. All of it. I love you too." The truth of it still surprised me, even though I came here planning to destroy you. Even though every logical instinct says this is disaster waiting to happen. I love you. He kissed me again, tender this time, promise rather than desperation. Then we build something new, not based on debt or obligation, based on choice and honesty and whatever chance we can steal from the chaos. 6 months later, Marco died in prison, shanked by an inmate who'd lost a sister to trafficking. Luca didn't claim responsibility, but I suspected strings had been pulled, debts called in, justice delivered through channels that bypassed official procedures. The threats against Chiara stopped. The security detail remained, but relaxed into routine rather than constant crisis. Life developed patterns that felt almost normal, despite the underlying awareness that danger was always possible. I moved into the estate officially, no longer just the tutor, but part of the family. Chiara called me something between Vera and Mama, testing different names until she found what felt right. Luca and I built relationship on foundation of complete honesty. No secrets or deceptions complicating what we shared. Sometimes I visited Anya's grave, bringing flowers and telling her about my unlikely life. About the man I'd intended to destroy who'd become the person I loved most. About the child I'd planned to use as leverage who'd become the daughter of my heart. About justice that came through unexpected channels and love that developed from the ashes of hatred. "I hope you'd understand," I told her stone. "I hope you'd forgive me for loving the brother of the man who killed you. For building family with people from the world you died trying to expose." The wind through cemetery trees sounded almost like absolution, or maybe just like wind. But I chose to believe my sister understood, that she'd want me to find peace and purpose even if the path there had been nothing like either of us imagined. The man who'd killed Anya was paying for his crimes. The child I'd saved had a future full of possibility, and I'd found something I hadn't known I was looking for. Family built on choice rather than blood. Love that survived the worst foundations and transformed into something genuine. Luca had asked how to repay the debt of his daughter's life. The answer turned out to be simple and impossible. ordinary and miraculous. Love me. Trust me. Build something honest from the wreckage of everything that brought us together. And somehow, against all probability, we did.